Economist.
Most people understand the simple appeal of preserving biodiversity, but how can you put a price on it in a way that makes sense to business? To find out, we had Pavan Sukhdev in for tea. Pavan is an economist and a banker, but at the moment he's in charge of the UN Environmental Programme's Green Economy Initiative and chairing a study called TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. There are interesting ways in the economics profession of assigning values to ecosystems and to ecosystem services as we talk about them now. It's a little harder to see how to go from assigning the value to actually finding some money that might flow from it, which is where economics gets interesting for many people.
Yes, that's quite true. And it's one thing to demonstrate value, as we say. It's quite another to capture it. And I think demonstration itself sometimes can have policy responses. If you demonstrate that a wetland outside Kampala, for example, an actual example, is in fact providing sewage treatment for the city, well, that's sufficient to convince the city not to convert it into additional agricultural land. It was 40 square kilometers that they were planning to do this for. But sometimes that demonstration isn't enough to make policies change. Sometimes you need capture. And the carbon markets are an example of that, where you've actually had to create a means of companies having a cap within which they can manage and trade, and they capture that value by saving some or spending some.
The carbon markets are an interesting example because they deal in a commodity, they deal in carbon. It doesn't matter who reduces the carbon, and you can find the most efficient place to do it. Markets' approaches to biodiversity, though, can't really be like that, can they? Because everything's local, everything's specific.
That is part of the problem. Markets can be part of the overall solution, but typically what you need is policy changes. You need sort of mechanisms where those who are the custodians of natural capital are rewarded for their function of maintaining and looking after those assets. So, for example, upstream farmers who are responsible with water supply and don't pollute it with nutrients and from fertilizers can be rewarded, paid in order to do so.
Whereas the classic paradigm is always to punish people for polluting rather than to reward them for not polluting.
Absolutely. But there's no logic which suggests that it shouldn't be the other way around.
That's a new form of regulation rather than something that a business can actually take on and own and make part of its own processes. Outside the regulatory sphere, how does this actually affect how businesses look at risk and opportunity?
Partly the risks are for businesses who depend on biodiversity. And again, I refer to the broader biodiversity. For instance, if you're an agricultural business, the quality of the agricultural commons, so to speak, will determine your output, your productivity. So you do depend a bit on the availability of fresh water and soil quality and nutrients. If you're, say, a logging company or a forestry company, well, you're concerned about access to that forest from which you draw your key resource. If you are a ecotourism company, for instance, you're deeply concerned about the environment within which you operate. So clearly there are some companies which are in businesses which per se depend on nature, and therefore they will be sensitive to the ebb and flow of the quality of those assets. There are other companies who are just opportunistically looking for future. For instance, REDD+, the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Now this is a scheme that's being proposed. I wouldn't call it a market as yet. I mean, it can lead to a market, but today it's just a sort of structuring opportunity. It's a mega structuring opportunity for governments and businesses to sit together and figure out how can you actually reward communities on the ground, the states that govern them and ensure that their capture of carbon in forests is actually secure, the governments who organize all that, other governments who actually pay for this, and yet constituents of those other governments, if you like, the developed world, who provide the financing for that. And that's a new opportunity. There are many estimates we received of the range of 10 billion to even 100 billion in some cases as potential size of that marketplace.
You mentioned farming earlier, and farming is an interesting and possibly slightly tricky proposition because it's obviously the part of the economy that impacts most directly on biodiversity. Yes. And it seems to me, and various people have made this case, that there's a distinction between increasing biodiversity on farms, as for instance we do in organic farming in temperate countries, and decreasing the amount of farms so that you can preserve biodiversity in wilderness settings. Do you see that as a trade-off, or?
It could be a false trade-off. You see, I think the argument that's being made there is that, well, intensive farming, by definition, intensifies yield, and therefore it must be using less land. That is true, it does. But equally, if you look at what its negative impacts are on biodiversity in terms of fertilizers and pesticides, especially chemical pesticides, creating depletions of insects and pollinators and so on, which then has follow-on effects on other forms of agriculture, then I think you need to sort of take a different view on that. And the other point I'll make is that, well, productivity is not only about yield enhancement using intensive farming. There was a study done a few years back called Julius Preti et al. In fact, they looked at a whole host of some 13,000 odd projects around the world which had made their purpose ecologically positive farming. In other words, looking at how to capture fresh water within the farm area, looking how to recycle farm manure, trying to grow biomass on land within the farm, in situ, grasslands between fields and forest patches between fields, as a way of increasing biomass. And across this study, they found that there was an increase in productivity of almost 80%, 80%. Can you imagine the average? Now, that to me says a huge thing about the problem of farm productivity in poor countries. Because here we were talking about the kind of farms which cover subsistence farming, which, as you know, provide food to the sort of and employment, indeed, to the 1.2 billion odd people who are at the bottom of the economic pyramid.
For a farmer, obviously, it's very clear how their job, or maybe not clear enough, but there are fairly obvious links between their job and biodiversity and biological growth. How about businesses which really don't feel part of that? There's an argument, and you do hear it from businessmen, that I would like to do the more environmentally conscious thing, but I know that the people investing in me are looking absolutely at the value of my shares and look whether I can justify this.
But to be honest, I don't blame that businessman. I mean, look, the reality is that the purpose of a corporation is its self-interest, and that's a legal principle. We can't get away from that. And there are those who argue that the CSR thing, if you are interested in CSR as a CEO, you had better make sure that it is for the purpose of enhancing your profit share or your market share or whatever it is, in some way enhancing the value of your firm. Otherwise, you are not being consistent with your commitment to shareholders. Well, I accept that. And that's the challenge, that what we have to look for is solutions where you in fact save money, or you in fact increase the willingness of your clients to trade with you. Look at Walmart, for instance. They ask questions of their suppliers, amongst which one of the questions is, how green is your product? And as a result of that, I think they do incentivize more conscious and perhaps more well-to-do consumers to go to Walmart stores. Well, that's good business.
This actually leads to a rather interesting thing, that if corporations, if businesses are to see this as a way of growing the company, in a sense that means also a way of moving beyond issues of, say, sustainability to issues of growth, of actually making the natural world better rather than just leaving it alone. Is that the long-term agenda?
Well, I'm certainly going to say yes, because I've gone to great lengths to prove that I think the green economy, if you like, one which ensures that natural capital is made more available for the bottom of the economic pyramid, because they are the ones who most depend upon its services, and one which ensures that new forms of energy use and materials use are constantly pressed into service to create more efficient business, more efficient product creation, and therefore more profit. I think these are the ways in which we need to think about this and see this not as a either-or situation, but very much a win-win game, where better greening and a green economy actually leads to more wealth.
Pavan, thanks very much for having tea with The Economist.
My pleasure.
Pavan's vision of green growth is a beguiling one, very unlike the idea of an untouched nature that most conservationists have in the past held dear. Convincing them and the world's investors should be an interesting challenge.